During the 20 months that this government has been in office, it has consistently sought to avoid responsibility for its own decisions. They have to put out a never-ending stream of press releases praising themselves as visionaries who are setting everything right. And this has been accompanied by a constant effort to diminish, to ignore, and then flat-out deny clear evidence of bad decisions and bad policies. Over recent months, the growing and avoidable crisis which decisions in the health sector are causing has been obvious to everyone. And even within the Cabinet, trust has broken down to the extent that the Taoiseach is now having the work of a minister checked independently. The impact of government decisions on the education sector has not received anywhere near the same attention. But this impact is very real, and it's growing all of the time. Last year, the government announced proudly that education had not only been given priority, all frontline education services had been protected. And the truth, of course, was exactly the opposite. There was no priority given to education, and cuts were specifically targeted at frontline services. And the result is obvious to anyone who cares to look at what is happening. At every level of the education system, it's not just that belts are being tightened, deliberate policy decisions are making the system less fair, more exclusive, and building problems which will cause lasting damage if left in place. And no doubt we'll shortly hear from the government speakers about how nothing is their fault and everything has been forced on them by a combination of the Troika and their predecessors. I think the government members should be warned that these speeches, always empty, are now causing the government's support to fall every time they're used in place of seriously addressing very real problems. The public can see through the arguments because they can remember the promises that were made early last year, when every last bit of economic data was available to Fine Gael and to Labour. And they can remember, the public can remember the signed pledges and the ringing commitment in the programme for government that fairness and frontline services in education would be protected. They have heard and understand the repeated statements of the Troika that individual spending decisions are fully at the discretion of the Irish government. These are your promises. No one forced you to make them, and no one forced you to break them. When Minister Quinn, when you attended a photo op outside Trinity College and gave your and Labour's solemn commitment not to increase charges at third level, you knew full well the fiscal situation. And the only thing that has changed since then is that Ministers Howland and Noonan have both said that things are actually better than planned. And that pledge was no solo run by an over-eager campaign manager. It was reinforced by the Taoiseach himself when he said on February the 19th last year, quote, "Labour is against third-level fees by either the front door or the back door," unquote. And in this debate, we will clearly not hear anything new from the Minister about his cynically made and quickly abandoned promises. And it was a new threshold in cynicism, in my view. Both the nature of that promise, the manner in which it was carried out, the raison d'etre behind it. It was sickening, it was cynical. And I think it's well past time for the Minister to acknowledge the impact of what has been done here. The increases in fees which he has implemented are already causing real hardship, particularly because of his decision to target cuts on maintenance grants at the same time as increasing the fees. And the evidence of a significant increase in student hardship in the last year is now overwhelming. The scale of it is such that the next step will be a fall-off in third-level attendance by the most economically marginalised groups. Over the last 2 months, the situation in relation to late payment of grants, as we've heard, for those who still qualify, has become a full-blown crisis. Many thousands of students have not received a reduced payment because of administrative chaos and problems under the direct control of the Minister. The SUSI system is failing students. The government should accept that it is and should rectify it. And despite promises given last week by the Taoiseach about students having full access to all they needed in college, we heard last night from students on Frontline that this is simply not the case. And since this problem emerged, students and families from all parts of the country have been pressing for urgent action. Yet if you look at the lengthy list of press releases and speeches made by the Minister during this time, not one addresses this crisis. Deputy Charlie McConnell-Logue persisted with parliamentary questions to get to the bottom of this issue, and it is only then did the full truth come out. At least now the Oireachtas Committee had met with staff from SUSI today. And it's obvious to all, and it has been for some time, that 65 staff is not enough to deal with over 66,000 applications. And of course, something that needed urgent attention. The 2 fee increases implemented under this government are only part of a longer series. As currently planned, it is this Minister's intention to increase student fees by far more than any of his predecessors. In opposition, Labour promised to cut these fees. During the election, they promised never to increase them. Now they're implementing an unprecedented series of 5 increases. What makes this much worse is that the cutting funding for access to third level is accompanied by targeted cuts at schemes to help disadvantaged students in first and second level. The Minister has delivered many speeches in which he has said that he will rescue an underperforming system. Sometimes his criticisms of the system have been balanced and reasonable, but more often they have involved putting the worst possible spin on statistics. Last week, I would suggest the Minister found himself in a bit of a quandary because he had to release a report showing that under his predecessors, school completion had increased significantly to 90%, which was a vindication of policies pursued well over the last decade. And at the same time, the greatest improvements were seen in the most disadvantaged schools. The underperformance of boys was being addressed, and there was greater equality between different types of schools. The Minister launched this report in as low-key a way as he could, and did so without acknowledging the work of teachers, parents, communities and public servants in delivering a fairer, more successful system. And he also failed to acknowledge that the DESH programme was targeted last year for cuts just at a time when it's delivering major progress, and it is delivering major progress. And while government speakers will obviously ignore this fact in their speeches, the facts show that cuts to disadvantaged schemes were first proposed by the Minister himself in his review of spending dated September the 9th, 2011. And the cuts which have been implemented were not imposed reluctantly. They were proposed by the Department as merely removing anomalies and damaging no one. In relation to career guidance, the cut of 700 posts was also suggested by the Department last year. In the internal documentation, the cut was entitled, and I quote, "the termination of the dedicated guidance service." And when the backlash happened, the Taoiseach and many ministers claimed that nothing was being terminated and that schools were simply getting the flexibility they had asked for, which is an appalling statement to make, a disgraceful, and you're still at it. I mean, it's absolutely. I've met with career guidance teachers, and I invite anybody to meet with guidance counsellors now in schools across the country. And we've all to talk about cyberbullying, we've all to talk about mental health, we've all to talk about suicide among young people. This was a disgraceful cut, because it really cut at the heart of our infrastructure in our second level schools that we're dealing with vulnerable young people. And teachers will tell you, principals will tell you, the volume of what they're dealing with in terms of issues is growing and growing. It was a mistake, Minister, and it should be reversed. And it was a shame that the Labour Party made that particular cut. It talks about fairness and equality, and it continues to work against those very principles in its education policy. And I believe in a greater diversity of patronage at primary level, but it's hard not to compare the time the government has spent on that issue to the time spent on real equality issues, such as the ones I've mentioned. We will be setting out a constructive alternative approach for the budget to be announced next month, and we acknowledge there are many areas where tough decisions must be implemented, but we don't accept that there is no alternative to every decision taken by every minister. Education deserves to receive the priority it was promised before the election and in the programme for government. And Labour and Fine Gael will be held to account by the people for their broken promises. But they will also be held to account if they see their decisions doing immense damage, but do nothing to reverse those decisions. And I would ask you on the career guidance to certainly look at reversing it. We saw what happened in Wexford. We saw what happened in certain schools where incidents did occur and where the department and the minister then made a belated intervention to return hours to the school. But this is a generic system-wide issue, and it's something that should be applied across the board. We shouldn't just wait for incidents to happen, particularly young people in certain schools, and then move to reverse it. And I think that's something that you should acknowledge happened, and we know it happened, and I have the detail in the file there in terms of the schools concerned, where because of cuts and the absence of guidance, and then you intervened. In relation to that, I think we need to really, if we're serious, there's no point in the Oireachtas committees meeting with all sorts of groups to do with mental health, when the one structure we had in place, dedicated ring-fenced service, which actually was doing a lot of work in terms of helping young people at a vulnerable stage in their life, you decided to unilaterally take out and leave it up to the schools. A more honest approach would have been to do it differently or not to do it at all.